I was talking to Franz de Waal the other day, primatologist who studied chimp behavior. And one of the things he said was that you give female juveniles, chimps, a block of wood that's, about this big, say, they'll frequently carry it around in their arms or carry it around in their back like an infant and care for it like a doll, even though it's just a block of wood. And the males, juveniles, do not do that. And if you give the female chimps a doll, a teddy bear or a doll or a chimp doll, whatever, they will definitely care for that. And then they will share it with their compatriots because chimps essentially have friendships. And they will become extraordinarily upset if the people that, or the chimpanzees that they're associating with, don't take proper care of the doll. If you give a doll to a juvenile male, he'll tear it apart to see what it's made of. And so that it's the projection of the infant onto the block of wood that's particularly interesting to me, because one of the things I see happening, I would say on a broad scale level in our society, this is perhaps where this might get somewhat contentious, is that I think with the feminine ethos that's centered on infant care, which is an extraordinarily important thing to be centered on given the dependency of our infants. Imagine the world is sort of divided into three parts. There's infants, there's infant caregivers, and there's predators. And so infants can do no wrong. Infant caregivers are motivated by the highest and noblest of motivations, which is essentially an all-encompassing empathy. And anyone who isn't either of those two things is to be regarded with severe suspicion. And that's a very good ethos if you're dealing with infants, but it's a very bad ethos if you're dealing with, larger scale social organizations. And I was reading these guidelines for faculty members at Mount Royal College in Calgary, and for a faculty retreat, which is really not one of the world's most dangerous, what would you say, happenings.
Yes.
And all of the faculty members were assured that trained counselors would be at hand in case the discussion became intense beyond the point of tolerability. And I thought, what's going on here? It's like, the faculty members are infants, and those who oppose their ideas are predators, and the appropriate moral ethos is to care for the infants. And it's like, yeah, except no, because they're not infants, and this is not mother and baby. And this is also, to me, it's also an extension of the Freudian nightmare, the Oedipal nightmare that produces both dependency and narcissism as a consequence of the overextension, the unregulated overextension of that essential ethos directed at infants.
Yes. Is
that too harsh?
I don't think so at all. And I think that mothers and fathers just have such different styles of parenting. And, with the common goal, we all want our children to do well. We all care about them. But what we know, what I saw when I did the research for the boy crisis, is that the children that didn't have dads in their lives, even the girls did worse in 50 different areas. They were more likely, the boys as well, but the boys more intensely in those areas. Both boys and girls who didn't have a lot of dad involvement, by the age of 9.5, their telomeres were shorter.
Wow.
14% shorter on average. That's the average between boys and girls when a father was not involved in a significant way by the time that child was 9.5. However, the telomeres of the boys were yet again 40% shorter than the telomeres of the girls. And many people don't know that the length of telomeres when you're 9.5 years of age is one of the best predictors of your life expectancy. The telomeres, carry, of course, the genes that tell you whether you're subject to cancer or vulnerable to any set of diseases. And so the fact
that they're determiners of senescence, right, of the onset of senescence, essentially.
Yes.
Wow, and so it's that basic.
It's that basic and
that early.
And that early, and and the impact on both girls and boys. I mean, there are certain differences between the lack of father on girls versus boys. For example, girls who don't have very much father involvement are far more likely to be pregnant as teenagers, because they that's oftentimes by not having father involvement, they don't know how to interact in a very socially nuanced way with a boy. They do know, though, that when they're 13, 14 years of age, that boy wants sex. And so if there's another girl that might give him sex and she wants to keep the boy and not have him go to the other girl, she'll go ahead and be sexual. And if he doesn't want to wear a condom, okay. She doesn't want to make his sexual experience one that.
Well, she has no experience under those conditions negotiating with any male. I know the data I remember, it's a few years old now, indicated quite clearly that girls with fewer brothers were much more likely to be raped. And I presume, and I've seen, brotherless girls among my clients, for example, some of whom were prone to sexual assault for all sorts of reasons. They had no idea how to negotiate no at an early stage.
Yes.
So by the time they were frightened enough to object, it was often so far along the unwanted amorous advance cycle that it was very difficult for things to stop. And of course, the guy on the other end presumes, often as unsophisticated as his victim, presumes that consent has already been obtained at that point. The girls with brothers have learned how to negotiate at that really embodied level, the same embodied level that probably emerges or underlies sophistication that emerges out of rough and tumble play with fathers and so on. So, yeah, I know. I mean, the paternal involvement seems really to me to boil down to something like a kind of a conditional encouragement. It's like, I really want the best for who you could be. And I'm also confident in your ability to attain that. And so I can hold you to high standards and enforce it because I think so much of you, so much of what you could be.
Yes.
And I think that is a lovely juxtaposition with that more maternal sense of, you always have a home here, we'll accept you in some real sense, no matter what you do. Not that women don't put conditions on their children, because of course they do, but we're talking about the way that's expressed in a very practical sense.
Yes.
And okay, so these boys that let's look at the more extreme case for a minute, these school shooters. So my understanding of their psychology is that they're resentful, they're low down on the status hierarchy, they're not attractive to potential mates, they're not necessarily very popular, they don't have a lot of hope for attaining any of that in the future. So they're very, very frustrated by that lowly position. And that makes them angry. It makes them resentful. Then it starts to generate compensatory fantasies, which would be, well, I'll do something. I'll show them. I'm going to be famous. Everybody's going to know who I am. And then they can drift into these violent fantasies. And sometimes that's motivated also by thoughts of direct revenge because they've been bullied and they've been pushed around. And so they have reasons to be angry, let's say. No, I'm not saying any of this is justified, by the way. I'm just saying how it works. And then they brood for months, and years, developing these fantasies of violence. But more importantly, focusing on the consequences for notoriety of the violent act. And so one of the things that I've been suggesting to people who are interested in this sort of thing is, especially people on the media side, is that they don't use the shooters' names. They don't report the shooters' names. And I think because the thing about the mass shooters in particular is they've learned how to hijack the media world to provide themselves with hundreds of millions of dollars worth of free publicity, to draw attention to their manifestos, for example. But also, and then they can have these fantasies. It's like the same kind of fantasy that a suicidal teenager will have, because the suicidal teenager will often fantasize about as if he's a spirit that will be there at his funeral, with everybody huddled around the coffin, including the boys and girls who rejected him, expressing their sympathy for the way that he behaved, expressing their sorrow for the mistreatment that he suffered. The parents are doing the same thing. And he sees this in a very dramatic sense. And there's an elaboration of that on the violence side. And they want to be notorious. And you ask why, and why boys, not girls? And the answer is, well, success to boys is linked with popularity with girls, for example, in a way that it's simply not linked for girls with boys. And it's a huge difference. So do you see anything wrong in that? You and I had an interesting experience that I wanted to touch on. So part of the reason I reached out to Warren in the aftermath of these events is because he got a letter 6 months ago, something like that, from a. You want to tell the story? Go ahead and tell the story.
Yeah. I opened my email and I saw a letter from somebody who was a Hispanic young man in Texas, actually, and he said to me, thank you for the Boy Crisis book. And he said, I was raised by my dad, and I was raised by, I was raised by my mom without a dad. And then I was passed on to my aunts, who both neither had a father or a man, a husband in their life, or a man or a boyfriend in their life. Then I was passed on to my grandmother. She didn't have a man in their life. None of them liked men very much. Mm-hmm. I heard negative things about my father, but I never really saw much or anything of him, and so I didn't have any structure. I didn't have any purpose. So I got involved with 4chan, and then I got involved with 8chan. And 8chan is a fascist group, and the fascist group gave me something I could count on, an ideology. It gave me structure. It gave me purpose. It gave me a sense
like a gang.
Yes, it's very much like a gang. It gave gangs give you respect when you don't feel you have respect. The gangs promise you respect, I should say, and so you become part of that family. And he felt very much part of that family. So he told me. So I wrote up a 52-page manifesto that was overlapping in its effectiveness. I thought it was even better than the two other people at 8chan who had become celebrated mass shooters. And he said, I was ready to, I was making the plans to carry it out. And in the process, I stumbled across the Boy Crisis book. And what he said to me was very powerful. He said, it wasn't the data that got to me. It was being seen, that you saw. It was like you were a spy in my life, telling me what I was feeling, the hurt that I had, the lack of structure, the lack of purpose, the loss of self, the feeling that I didn't have that boundary enforcement. Therefore, I didn't have that discipline. I didn't have anything that anybody that would tell me that's too much, that's too little, that's you're doing that wrong, and
you could do better.
And you could do better. And you were explaining all that. And just being seen for my vulnerabilities made me not have the energy that I had to begin to continue carrying out my what I had outlined in my manifesto. And so he ended it by saying, thank you for saving not just my life, but the lives of countless others, because I was really working this. So there would have been countless others. So I would have been seen as doing something that he felt was positive, that is helping the fascist ideology to be more broad spread. And so, what I really, my heart is saying to people that I hear is that when we see a mass shooter, or we see somebody with in this type of modality, we see that they're angry, and we tend to have anger at their anger, as opposed to having empathy at their vulnerability. And what this fellow was telling me was, you had empathy at about my vulnerability, and when I saw that you saw my vulnerability, I lost my anger, or my anger diminished enough to not make me want to follow through so systematically on my 52-page manifesto. And I did end up going to a couple of psychologists. I did a few sessions with him as well. I wrote to you about it. You gave me some guidance as to what to do with him. And so, and almost the exact same pattern happened with also in Texas. He was doing poorly in school. He dropped out of school. He had a speech impediment. He was being bullied. He was feeling like he was a failure on almost every aspect of life. And then he began. I was mentioning to you, I think offline, that he had this girl, a fantasy about a girl named Anita, and he was texting her and saying, "I'm going to be see my guns here on TikTok, see my guns on Instagram, and watch out for me, Anita. I'm going to be doing something." And he's going, get out of here. It's just, I don't know you. But
that shows you the degree of fantasizing, right? Because what that means in some sense is that, to put myself in his position, which is of course an uncomfortable thing to do, is he's constructed this girl in his imagination. And she would be, maybe she looked at him one day and that would be enough. And now he's imagining that if he can only elevate himself to notorious status, that he would become an object of admiration. And God only knows how many hundreds of hours he might have spent fantasizing about that, fantasizing about the relationship he'd have with the girl and how much she would admire him and how everyone would know his name. And you don't get to the point where you do something like shoot up a school without, I would say, literally hundreds of hours of fantastic dreaming. Yes. About the event, about the day, mostly about what's going to happen afterwards and how your name is going to be on everyone's lips. It's so striking, that young man who reached out to you was deterred by what was essentially an accurate diagnosis of his situation, and that was sufficient. When I'm out on my tours talking to audiences, many of whom are young men who are suffering the consequences of the sorts of things that we've been discussing, the thing that's been so terrible to me to see is to the degree to which so many of them are suffering so intensely for lack of a single encouraging word. Yes. And it's so sad that they have to get that from me on YouTube or in a lecture, that they haven't had anyone in their life. And we're in this situation now where, frequently any manifestation of masculine ambition in even its juvenile forms, the desire to engage in rambunctious play, let's say, is instantly associated not only with pathology that needs to be medicated, let's say in the case of ADHD, which I do think is a disorder of repressed play, and Jaak Panksepp did a lot of work showing that might be the case, but also that, we associate that male ambition with, the force that's literally the patriarchal oppressive force that's literally destroying the world. It's like, how the hell do you expect young men to react to that? And the answer might be something like, there's too bloody many people on the planet anyway. And if we stopped running around doing things, things would be a lot better. It's like, that really leaves them nowhere to go, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So except to some very dark places in some situations.